We are continuing the series that we've been doing in recent weeks on women of the Bible. And this week, we're going to look at the character of Hannah. And for any word nerds among us, Hannah is one of those biblical characters whose name is a palindrome, which means it's spelt the same backwards and forwards. And by my reckoning, I think there are 10 such names in the Bible that are the same backwards and forwards spelt. So if you can't sleep tonight, that's your job, okay? Try and remember the 10, and that'll more than send you off for 40 winks, I tell you. So Hannah is one of the famous palindromes in the Bible, but more importantly than that, what else is she famous for? Well, although she's married to a guy called Elkanah, Hannah is one of several women in the Bible whose stories revolve around infertility and the deep longing for a child. Indeed, in Hannah's day, which was over 3,000 years ago now, it was a pretty sexist, might say patriarchal culture, and childless women were often, sadly, shunned in society. For Hannah, though, it wasn't so much her husband Elkanah who gave her a hard time, as it was, wait for this, her husband's other wife who gave her grief. Yes, polygamy was all the rage in those days, having more than one wife. It was pretty much standard practice in some ancient biblical cultures, which kind of makes you wonder what people mean when they talk about having a biblical view of marriage. I'm not quite sure it tallies with this day and age. But that aside, Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and a woman called Peninnah. And it was Peninnah who was particularly mean to Hannah. So we read this, for example, at the beginning of the book of Samuel, in which Hannah's story is told. It says, there was a man whose name was Elkanah. He had two wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. And Peninnah kept provoking Hannah in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband, Elkanah, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Now, although we're told elsewhere that Elkanah loved Hannah, it comes across, I think here, as a little bit clueless, really. Assuming that Hannah shouldn't be too upset at being childless because she's got him for a husband, and isn't he worth more than 10 children? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons, he says. Whereas perhaps if he'd spent maybe a bit more time listening to her and been more aware of the way that his other wife had been bullying Hannah year after year, he'd have understood the real reasons for her sorrow. And yet, despite her sadness and her pretty clueless husband in many ways, it seems Hannah remained faithful to God. Indeed, there's a little detail in the next verse which is particularly significant when we're told this, that when they had finished eating and drinking, Hannah stood up. And you might think that's a very minor detail. So what? She stood up. But actually, this standing up, even though it's a pretty standard thing to do, the fact that it's mentioned at all implies that it was more than just getting up from the table at the end of a meal. Now, it reads like a statement of intent on her part, dusting herself down almost, like a determination on Hannah's part to persevere in her faith in her own way, despite her husband's ignorance and despite Peninnah's harassment of her. Indeed, having stood up, we're told Hannah then went to the temple to pray. We're told this, that in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. And it's a big prayer. It's a selfless prayer. Lord, give me a son, and I'll promise I'll give him back to you for your service. In fact, it seems Hannah prayed so passionately at this time that we're told the priest of the temple, a guy called Eli, accused her of being drunk. Another man perhaps not displaying the biggest amount of awareness, perhaps. But despite being harassed by her fellow wife of Elkanah, despite being maligned and misunderstood by the priest in the temple, Hannah bravely stands her ground. Having been accused of being drunk, she says, "Not so, not so. I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." And so Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." And in time, Hannah's prayers were answered, because she did indeed go on to have a son called Samuel. And Hannah kept her promise to God, because when Samuel was 3 years old, she took him to the temple and handed him into the priest's care, where he grew up under Eli's guidance. We're told Hannah continued to visit Samuel every year. She made clothes at home for him and brought them to him, clothes that we're told she lovingly made, before eventually Samuel grew up, as we may know, to be one of Israel's most important prophets. Now, Samuel's story, that's perhaps for another time. But what might we learn from Hannah's life? Well, I think 2 quick thoughts to reflect on and perhaps take away today. I think firstly, thinking of Hannah, I think I'm struck by the honest, faithful way in which Hannah related to God. It was very real, her prayers, if we think about it. Very vulnerable. She'd had a hard time in life, living with the, at the time, social shame of being childless, while being bullied year on year by her husband's other wife. And yet she stood up, both figuratively and literally, for her faith in God, being determined to keep trusting, to keep relying, to keep being honest with God about her sadness, her grief, her hopes for the future. And yes, in time, Hannah's prayers were answered with the arrival of Samuel, and I think she eventually went on to another 5 children. But her faith wasn't dependent on simply getting what she wanted. No, even if she'd have remained childless, it seems Hannah would have trusted God enough to keep pouring out her soul to him in tough times as well, as she knew that God would uphold her through life's ups and downs. And for me, I find that a pretty inspiring example to follow. There's real courage, real strength, real dynamism with Hannah. But then secondly, I think Hannah's willingness to follow through on her promise and hand her son Samuel over to God for his service, well, that's a hugely selfless act that set Samuel on course to have an immensely important ministry as a prophet to the whole people of Israel. And if we think about it, I think Hannah displays some pretty godly qualities, giving up her son for the benefit of others. Well, there are echoes, I'd suggest, of the ways in which God the Father gave up his son, Jesus, for our sakes. Hannah's example, therefore, makes her, as I say, a pretty godly person all round. A model of someone who lived out the truth of words that Jesus himself would say a couple of thousand years later when he said that it is more blessed to give than receive. And that certainly seems to be the case in Hannah's life. Indeed, it's interesting. The name Hannah means favor or grace. And I guess my prayer as we perhaps hold Hannah in our thoughts and are maybe inspired by her life and faith this week, that we would know God's grace and favor as we follow Hannah's example in living lives of faith, trusting in God's faithfulness to us. Amen.